Albrun, the editor of the National Interest, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome two of my colleagues to our Zoom session today, Greg Priddy and Josh Yaffe, both of whom are senior fellows at the Center for the National Interest. And we are going to discuss a topic that is garnering not inconsiderable attention, which is the current hostilities between Israel and Iran. And President Trump has just announced that he might or he might not intervene directly himself. So I'd like to kick it off by asking a question to Greg, which is, Greg, are we on a slippery slope toward entanglement in the Middle East, which was the very issue that Trump campaigned on and won numerous adherents by denouncing the Second Iraq War? Or do you think things might work out well in the Middle East?
So I think we're probably 95% of the way down the path to U.S. involvement now. And if Trump had wanted to steer clear of that, he would have had to do some things a couple of weeks ago to get off of that path. Netanyahu had wanted to deal with this militarily, and I think he's played this pretty skillfully. Netanyahu created the perception in the U.S. government that there was kind of a juggernaut of strikes coming down the pike, and that Trump would need to push back on that really hard if he wanted to prevent it. Trump didn't want to have that argument with Netanyahu. And they also presented some new intelligence that apparently was a bit different than what the U.S. intelligence community had given him, but, clearly changed, from his recent remarks, changed his views a bit on the immediacy of the threat from Iran on nuclear weapons. I think at this point, the key structural logic here is that Israel has done a lot of damage to the nuclear program, but there are remaining pieces of it, not just Fordo, but primarily Fordo, that are, Fordo buried deeply underground. Only American bunker busters of the largest class of those weapons can touch that. And that's not something Israel has been able to deal with. They haven't struck that yet. So I think Trump is probably going to at least want to get involved in a relatively short campaign. This is the lower end of what could happen. He's at least going to want to use a short campaign to deal with some of those loose ends from the nuclear program. Because if we're in a situation where if those loose ends were left not dealt with, the Iranians might be able to break out with those centrifuges with the 60% HEU that's left around. And it's really hard for us not to get involved at this point. So I think that, we are headed in that direction toward at least some degree of involvement in this campaign. And that probably, then the question of Iranian retaliation against U.S. bases and whether it can spread from there.
Lots for us to get into. Josh, I'd like to turn to you and ask the same question and add, is it actually, as Greg appears to be suggesting, likely or even inevitable that the U.S. becomes a direct party to this conflict, or do you think Trump can still stay on the sidelines?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Greg said. I think that there's a high likelihood that the U.S. gets involved, at least for dealing with Fordo. And it just seems that even as much as the administration has tried to keep a distance from activities that are going on, it has dropped subtle hints along the way the last week that the administration has made plans for what involvement would look like. Pulling all of our diplomats out of the region from Iraq, Bahrain, and Kuwait, not pulling dependents of diplomats out was a clear sign that there was deep consideration within the administration of what it would mean, the consequences of direct involvement. So I agree with Greg in that regard. But if you want to talk about sort of longer term, what does it look like? There's this big debate within circles on the right about isolationism or restraint, as some people call it, versus interventionism, or what some people would consider to be sort of a new form of neoconservatism. And Israel's caught up in the middle of that debate, and whether to support Israel or not to support Israel is a much larger question of whether folks on the right want to be deeply involved in conflicts around the world and other messy foreign affairs that may not have easy solutions and deals that can be made. And it's interesting to see as this unfolds, the more Israel succeeds, the more isolationists on the right may get what they want. You can easily imagine the outcome of this, in which, regardless of what happens in Tehran with the regime, that Israel is able to lay down the terms of its engagement with the region and rewrite the security dynamics of what goes on in the Middle East, allowing the United States to withdraw large numbers of forces and refocus its efforts on China, which is what a lot of people on the isolationist right wanted in the first place.
So you're essentially sketching out the vision of Israel as the de facto or military hegemon of this region, now that it has quashed Hezbollah in Lebanon. You've had the ouster of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and now the third domino, as it were, would be Iran.
I called a friend in Riyadh this morning about a different matter. We were talking other affairs, and he happened to say to me in the middle of it, it's quite possible that Tehran and Damascus will normalize with Israel before Saudi Arabia does. So you just think about that for a minute.
Well,
He's
it
not
is
wrong.
interesting that Syria has remained quiescent about the Israeli strikes on Iran, has it not?
Okay, so you're right. This is an important point that the media has not been covering, the commentators have not been focusing on the last couple months. We wrote a piece about it in the National Interest. It's important to note how many points of leverage Israel has over the transitional government right now. And it's unclear what the ultimate goal of that is. It's clearly paying off right now. Ahmed Ashara has publicly said they're not going to stand in the way of what Israel is doing. But you have to imagine that Netanyahu and the coalition government have a reason for stacking up all these points of leverage over the transitional government in Damascus, and that they will want to cash in some of those chips over time. And what that is a big question. What we wrote about is the potential that what Netanyahu wants is a transfer of Palestinian residents out of Gaza. They need somewhere to go. There were discussions back in January about a number of different countries that can take them in, among which was Syria. And I wouldn't be surprised to see al-Shara at some point saying that can be accommodated in exchange for the relief of all these other pressure points the Israelis have. Even in the cover of what's been going on the last 2 days, there's news reports of the Israelis demolishing homes on the Syrian side of the Golan border. So again, what do the Israelis want? But if you say, is this a new Israeli regional order? Not necessarily. Turkey matters, and what Turkey wants is not clear to me. It's clear that the United States has been pushing Israel and Turkey to meet and to get together and talk through whatever issues they have. But Erdogan has a lot of influence of his own, not just in Syria, but he will have vis-a-vis Iran, whatever happens. And it's not clear to me what Erdogan wants and how he wants to achieve it.
Greg, I'd like to get to that was very interesting, and we're going to circle back to that. Greg, I want to get back to the nitty gritty of what's going on right now. Do you think that if Trump launches these bunkerbusters on Iran, on Fordow, A, will it work? And B, what will be the strategic consequences for the U.S.? Do you anticipate the Iranian regime then striking out at American military bases centered in the Middle East?
So I'm a bit more pessimistic on this than Josh. In full disclosure, for anyone who reads my Twitter feed or my writings, I am a very moderate restrainer. I'm not all the way in that camp, but I have restraint leanings. I think in terms of what it's going to do to Fordo, that's That's a very good question, and we have never been able to simulate precisely the type of rock that is above. We've done some tests trying to simulate that, but we're not going to know until we try it. I think that the assumption in the U.S. military has been that we might have to hit it several times, where we're literally going and digging down and then essentially breaking rubble that we're jackhammering down into it with 6 or 8 warheads. But we've got enough to do that. And the massive ordnance penetrator, that biggest bomb that we have, was designed really for this mission. So I think we probably have the capability to do it. I don't think, there's a question. Some people would say that Iran is going to just sit on their hands and not do anything more because they're going to be so terrified. They still have a lot of things that they can throw at us. They are running down the supply of longer range missiles that they've been using against Israel, but they have much more numerous short range systems like the facto 110 and of course all the drones. And I think that you will see some blowback at US bases. I personally think it is difficult to see them swallowing their pride and not doing that. The question is, will it be limited to hitting US bases, or would it also include shipping oil? There is a big hurdle for the Iranians to do that because, one, they have had rapprochement with, the Saudi-Iran normalization has been going well, and that's something that I think had been a success story. I don't think the Iranians really want to do that, but it also is the case that that is really the only pain point that they have to hit at the US. And they have a capability there is quite high. People always talk about shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, but the more immediate vulnerability is, specifically that facility Abqaiq that they hit in 2019. And that was calibrated. They only hit they only hit a portion, less than 30%, of the sulfur separation towers there. You have to get the sulfur gas out of the oil before you put it on a tanker because it's unstable. So they calibrated that attack so that it would not have a significant economic impact. You route around the damage because the facility is run at under capacity and had excess capacity built in to deal with something like that. But if they were to take down more of that facility with sustained campaign, and they also, now that it's better defended, they'd probably use ballistic missiles rather than drones or a combination of the two. But if you actually could take that offline, that's potentially several million barrels a day that cannot be routed anywhere else to have the sulfur gas taken out and would have to be shut in. That also happens to be downstream from most of the Saudi spare capacity. So when you, in oil market analysis, when you talk about Saudi spare capacity and bringing that on to deal with a disruption event, it becomes irrelevant if that piece of infrastructure goes out, because that is the piece of infrastructure that you need to connect and process that to the export terminal. So they have something that they can probably do with accurate short-range ballistic missiles. And if they wanted to, it's just, they don't want to do it because of the relationship with the Saudis, but it is the one way they could really hit at Trump and, his domestic constituencies that are going to be wary of this. So I think it's hard to hazard a projection right now. It's a very high hurdle to get over to do that, but they can.
Josh, you are clearly fascinated by this internal debate on the right over Iran and Israel. And Scott McConnell in the American Conservative has a piece today where he says that America is being chain ganged, in his words, into joining a war that he believes will be an imperial fiasco for the United States. And for Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, and others are saying that this will be the final blow to the American empire, as it were, and that Trump will destroy his presidency by intervening in the Middle East. And for them, this is really Iraq war redux, right? That the Pat Buchanan and others John Mearsheimer Stephen Walt warned about the second Iraq War in 2003. They proved to be largely vindicated by what turned into a debacle. Now, the argument is that we're seeing a rerun with Donald Trump, of all people, the very candidate who declared an end to endless wars in the Middle East. Do you share this concern, or do you think each situation is its own? That this could, in fact, turn out dramatically differently?
Look, one of the problems that you face in dealing with Washington attitudes towards Israel and Iran and this set of issues, now that we're in this conflict that people have been predicting for the last 20 years and has never occurred, now it's occurring, 25 years. Now you have to look back and you have to face a problem. It's a problem in Washington, and it's a problem of how we understand both Israel and Iran. You have an industry built up in Washington around Iran. Over this last decade or more, you have hundreds or thousands of people who have built their careers as Iran experts, many of them knowing very little of the culture or the language, none of them having visited there. And people making their promotions, their career promotions, based on their ability to shout the loudest and advocate the hardest on one side or another for either invading Iran or making a peace with Iran, right? If you go hard to the left or hard...
Are you including Senator Ted Cruz in this, who has been flushed out by Tucker Carlson? I don't know if you saw the interview, but he didn't know how many people live in Iran. He doesn't know the various ethnicities. I don't think he knows the first thing about it.
I respect Ted Cruz for a lot of reasons, but the reality is that in Washington, for as much as people talk Iran, extremely few people know anything about Iran. It's maybe to the benefit in the last few years that you have this group of actual Iranian-born American citizens who have taken up jobs in the government. I know you had the controversy then a year or two ago where Tehran claimed that some of these people were sleepers advocating for their government. I don't know the truth or the untruth about that, but I do know that there is such an industry built up around this, and there's so many shysters out there promoting themselves with so little expertise on it. I don't pretend to be an expert on Iran in any way, shape, or form. Certainly not. But the problem is that it creates a bubble and a false sense of certainty that we understand what's going on or what's not going on. What are the assumptions that underlied the basis for believing that a war against Iran would have these detrimental, deleterious blowback effects to the United States? Part of the underlying assumptions were that Iran would activate its proxies throughout the region to target not just Israel, but U.S. assets of a vital interest. Okay. Well, in the last 2 years, Israel has slowly and steadily rolled up the capabilities of each of those proxy forces. That was a fundamental underlying assumption why we should not allow Israel to do what it is currently doing. So, okay, someone needs to go back and reassess the assumptions on which it was based that so many in Washington advocated against allowing Israel to do this type of activity. I think that the types of issues that Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Steve Bannon, and these other individuals, the types of ideas they're promoting, which have their place and have their value, need to be understood in terms of U.S. National interests over the long term. There has to be some form of engagement with the world. And to say that supporting Israel in all of its activities is going to have deleterious effects, then you have to ask yourself: is that really a reflection of the reality on the ground, in which Iran doesn't have the capabilities it once had and isn't able to mount a defense the way we once expected it to? Or is that simply a reflection of an internal political debate in Washington that is detached from the reality on the ground?
Let me pose another question to you about Arab armies. I think it was Ken Pollock who, in his dissertation, looked at the record of Arab armies. And, there have been contentions that what appeared to be Israel's phenomenal wins against overpowering forces. In fact, if you look back at Sir John Glubb's memoirs, who was an advisor to the Jordanians after 48, he said that the Arabs never had a chance. They were not unified. The armies are not well trained. Are we actually seeing another example of that the Iranian regime is corrupt and sclerotic? Greg?
So I think we're going to find out. I'm not sure that the Ken Pollock analogy holds for Iran. I mean, that was specifically about some deficiencies in how Arab armies were constituted. So, but leaving that aside, we're testing all these assumptions right now. I disagree with quite a bit of what my colleague had said earlier, just about, I think that Iran has a lot of capabilities that we don't know if they're going to use them or not. And that goes to their policy calculations. That also goes to their sense of national pride. Those things do come into play when you're deciding how to retaliate against something like this. Do they have the capability to hit shipping, hit oil, hit bases? Yes. And that's a different set of things. That doesn't involve proxies. That's a different set of things that are involved in striking back at Israel. So these are weapons they haven't been using yet. How exactly that plays out, we have yet to see, but they have the capabilities. And one other thing to say, just to add to what Josh was saying earlier, I think this idea of a Pax Israelica that goes across the region, there's a lot of truth to that now. And Israel has the military campaign has been amazingly competent and well put together, as usual for them. They've done some amazing things. But there's a question of whether a country that small, reliant on a reserve military, is going to be able to prop that tent up without U.S. help over a long period of time. And that's where I'm worried, because I think we could end up with a mowing the lawn situation with Iran, where they're trying to reconstitute their nuclear program. The government has, we've done a lot of damage to the government, but they try to reconstitute, and then we end up having to go do it again and again. And elsewhere around the region, where you're going to see these start to reconstitute and build back. But Pax Israelica is still going to have a lot of aggrieved people around the region with an axe to grind who are trying to build the capabilities to push back on it. And that raises the question of whether the U.S. gets pulled in to backstop that.
Josh, what do you think?
No, Greg's absolutely right. This regime in Tehran, the Islamic Republic, is not going to negotiate its own drawdown from the escalation. They can't. They have staked out the hill that they will die on, and it is this nuclear program. And their willingness to push back against public dissent over the last 10 years should be signal enough that they're not going to negotiate their way down from all of this under the terms that have been proposed to them. You don't need Khamenei's speech today to tell you that. So I think Greg is absolutely right. There are still capabilities. They will use them. And at some point, they have no reason not to use them, since there's not going to be a negotiation in any realistic sense. And so that does open up a whole nother set of military concerns and defense considerations. I think that in terms of the cohesion of the Iranian military forces and the security forces and the cohesion of the regime itself, the biggest indicator that we're going to get in the next week or two is you're going to have a large outflow of financial capital and citizens trying to leave the country. That's just a simple fact. It's a risky proposition to remain in Tehran right now, and people can't possibly have much confidence in their own security forces' ability to withstand a full-throated campaign from the Israelis for the next 2 weeks. So the regime is going to have to do something about capital outflows and human outflows. And when the regime starts to impose controls at the borders and controls on the finances, I think that's when you're going to see the friction rub up against between regime and society, and then you're going to see how things play out there. So I would like to see the response from average everyday citizens once the regime tries to bring in under control the capital flight and human flight.
Greg, I wanted to ask you about Trump's declaration the other night that the only thing that would satisfy him was not some kind of revised arms control deal, but unconditional surrender. Now, unconditional surrender was imposed on Germany and Japan in World War II. That term means that there's nothing to talk about. And it usually provokes an adversary into fighting to the death. Because
it means someone's going to the gallows.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing to debate about or discuss. It's not going to end with some kind of compromise. How seriously do you and Josh take this? Greg, go first.
I think that was Trump, going on a Twitter tear without having thought through it. And that's part of this is the policy process in this administration is broken. You've got a lot of things that are happening without adequate discussion and deliberation, and you've got too few people with expertise in the room for that. In terms, I think Trump is going to want to hit Fordo, finish the job, and then Trump, I think right now is thinking they're going to cave. In a week or two from now, they're going to be on their knees in front of me begging for a deal. And when it doesn't happen, when it doesn't happen, and when they actually do strike back against American bases, he's going to be kind of surprised. And then this could end up dragging on for a while.
This gets at an even larger issue, which is that Trump also claimed that he could get peace in Ukraine in 24 hours. The Gaza conflict continues to grind on. So you think the same mindset is operative when it comes to Iran?
Yeah, I think Trump sees this as an easy fix where they're going to crawl back to him and want a deal and be eating out of his hand. And that's not going to happen.
Josh?
A lot depends on how long this campaign goes on, and a lot depends on the nature of it as it escalates. Look, it's hard for me to see a way that the regime doesn't come under threat of change of some sort. Maybe not as a result of this campaign directly, but in the weeks and months following it, it's hard to imagine a situation in which the military and the Revolutionary Guard themselves don't question the judgment and the leadership of their own civilian, head. And that's a very difficult situation. What you had at the end of the Iraq War with Saddam Hussein, there were a lot of talks about should the U.S. get involved and go deeper and take out Saddam. And in the end, there was a decision not to cross the line. And in 1991, 92, 93, what you had was the settling in of reality in which the U.S. tried every measure it could, sanctions, no-fly zones, you name it, international pressure, trying to encourage the Iraqi people to rise up. And of course, when some Iraqi people did rise up, they were immediately put down brutally, and a lot of them ended up having to go into exile. As a result, some of them to the United States. You could end up in a situation like that, where the regime simply will not negotiate and it will suffer through, and it takes a gamble and says we can put down any localized dissent that arises, and you end up in a indefinite 2-3 years of international isolation for the Iranian regime, brutalizing its own people, and no ability to influence that situation by the international community except to watch it slowly fester, and people in Washington saying, well, we should have been less restrained, and we should have been more directly involved to begin with to push it over the edge when we had the chance, but now we've missed that chance. That was exactly where we were, 91, 92, 93. So a lot depends on the next few weeks and months, the level of the campaign. If the U.S. gets involved now, then does that create a tipping point for the regime or not? So I don't know how to answer it. We need another week or two to see how the military combat plays out.
Russia has explicitly warned the Trump administration not to intervene militarily in the conflict. How much credence do you place in that? How important do you think that is, Greg?
I think that's a very low importance. This agreement they signed recently, the Treaty of Cooperation, whatever they called it, did not have any defense provisions. They basically have an arms supply relationship. It's going to be unfortunate for Russia that they're not going to be able to be getting drones from Iran anymore for a while. But Russia has their hands full. They don't have forces deployed into the region, and this is really just rhetoric.
What about the impact on global energy prices? Do you see a potential for it going up to 150 a barrel?
Potential, yes. Now, as I outlined, there is a big hurdle to get it. They do not want to hurt Saudi Arabia. That's something that they would do in extremis to get at the U.S. and something they don't want to do to the Saudis because they want that relationship to continue to improve. And they also don't want to drive the Saudis toward us. But if they get over that hurdle and they actually were able to, damage infrastructure, and I assume if they did that, they wouldn't just hit Abqaiq. They would hit other facilities in other GCC countries. That probably not all of them, but some others, and they probably would also follow that up with naval measures, mainly anti-ship missiles and mines to try to impede shipping. And if they did all of that, we can clean up the naval aspect of it in probably 6 weeks. That's more doable. But some of that infrastructure damage takes inherently, even if you throw money at it, it's going to be several months before you've got it back up and running. There are inventories of oil around. We're not going to run out of oil. That's not the question. But when inventories go abnormally low, prices go way up. We've seen that. So if they did everything that they could possibly do, yes. But it's far from a foregone conclusion that they're going to go to that level because it has blowback for them as well.
Josh, do you have any thoughts on that?
I defer to Greg on oil and gas and energy prices. He knows far more than I'll ever know about the topic.
Let me ask you guys as a final question, because the situation is obviously fluid. Just give me your gut sense. Is this war the march of folly, or do you think things are going to turn out well? Greg?
I'm definitely in the march of folly camp. I don't think this is Armageddon, but I think that we're going to be in for a protracted conflict that does not have a really, there's not going to be an armistice at the end or some date at which we agree on something. It will peter out as the sides get exhausted and run down their munitions. And then we'll have a very uneasy aftermath, in which case, we may very well have Iran trying to reconstitute their nuclear program outside safeguards. And that's a very messy ending where we could end up repeatedly involved over the next several years.
Josh?
It doesn't, to a certain extent, some of the outcome of the war is already decided now. Iran is no longer the presence on the regional international scene as it was, and it cannot go back to the status quo that existed before. None of its proxies can go back to the status quo that existed before October 7th. And that's a new reality that the region has not yet adjusted to. But with this campaign, it's going to have to adjust to that new reality now. That doesn't mean a Pax Israelica, Pax Israeliana. but for instance, it doesn't mean Saudi Arabia is going to normalize with Israel right now. It's not going to. But it does mean that certain forms of defense and security cooperation across the Gulf and across the region can occur that couldn't have occurred before. But more than that, it means that certain taboos are broken that cannot be reestablished. Certain red lines have been crossed that can't be restored. Israel sets a new definition of what deterrence is in the region moving forward. And that has a major implication, but it has a major implication that I don't think the administration here has fully processed yet, because you can have this debate about restraint and about intervention and what's good and what's bad, but the reality is the dynamics are already changing in the Middle East, and we are not part of that discussion. So fine, if the US wants to get involved in the campaign now and do some sort of limited action on Fordo, that may not be much, but it will be highly symbolic, and it will allow the U.S. to be involved in what takes place after this conflict in a more centralized way than it would be as of now when it is sitting on the sidelines and watching. And not only that, but depending on what that level of U.S. involvement entails, it could have a major outcome on what Iran and its government looks like coming out of this conflict, and what regime stability looks like coming out of this conflict. The one thing that I don't think anyone wants to end up in is a situation where Israel's campaign has a limited cutoff line as to what they accomplish. They go home, they've destroyed large parts of the nuclear program and decapitated certain parts of the security leadership, and that's all that Israel can do. And then we enter a situation in which the Iranian government is unstable but still in place, and isolated from the world, brutalizing its own people, and unable to, with no one able to do anything about that fact. Perhaps resulting in large, as Greg mentioned, large damage to energy and oil infrastructure and the global energy economy in the process. And the U.S. then, without serious policy options for cleaning up this situation or having any impact as to how to move on from it, to end up in a situation where, like Greg said, you have no sort of armistice even. You just have nothing at the end of it, where nobody talks to anyone and everyone shouts at each other from behind their defensive lines. That seems to me to be the worst outcome. And the U.S. has a chance to influence that now. I'm not sure what that looks like or how it wants to do that, but sitting on the sidelines does not help you to do that.
So we have two good questions from our audience, one from Peter Zwack and the other from Donald Smith. I'm going to ask the one from Mr. Smith first. He asks, how does regime change occur? Regular army, outer provinces, assassination of Khomeini. Greg?
We don't know. That is one that I think we all have to admit and have a lot of humility about. You know, even with all the resources of the U.S. intelligence community, we totally didn't get when the Shah was going to fall. And so I don't think that there are a lot of ways it could happen, but I don't think that anybody sitting on the outside, including people who are reasonably well informed, is going to be able to foresee that. To the extent that there is one that strikes me as more likely than the others, that would probably be a more military-dominated government. Particularly if Ayatollah Khamenei ends up being struck by Israel or the U.S. The military stepping in is one obvious way. But I think the uncertainty over that is very high, and we don't know.
Josh?
Yeah, look, regime stability is a very complicated issue, no matter where you are, what you're talking about, because it's layered in so many ways, and there's so many elements of society that are involved. And when you go back and try and do a post-mortem on why a government fell, it's extremely difficult. It's not just difficult for intelligence analysts in the moment to figure out what's happening. It's hard for historians years later, decades later, to go back and piece together what is the stick that breaks the camel's back. You can point to all sorts of elements and you can imagine them playing out now. But I think the real question isn't that, but the real question is, if the situation in Tehran descends, rapidly at some point, either during this campaign or immediately after this campaign, much more likely after this military campaign is over, then does that result in chaos, like the Iranian Revolution when it first broke out? Or does it result in the Revolutionary Guard stepping in and seizing government and establishing its own military junta of sorts?
So we also have a question from Peter Swack. I'll start with you, Greg, which is, he notes that the IDF is massing for an incursion into Gaza. The Israelis might make a big push into the West Bank. How do they reconcile all this with the Iran war?
It might be something where they may perceive an opportunity to get some of that done while all the chips are up in the air and everything is chaotic. The politics of that in Israel, and I'm sure Josh can speak to this more, but that has changed radically. The idea of population transfer 30, 40 years ago was outside the pale. That was kind of beyond the pale for Israeli politics. That was a kind of 5% fringe idea. But now, with Gaza in particular, it seems to be policy. And, I'm definitely worried that there may be a perception in Israel that this is a time when they can get some of those things done when there are not constraints there that there would ordinarily be.
Josh?
Look, that's a big issue. The big issue is domestic Israeli politics. Bibi's not going to be around forever. Nobody is around forever. And coming out of this, what does Bibi want? And politically, what can he achieve? So I agree with Greg that under cover of this conflict the next couple weeks, no doubt the government in Israel will make moves on other fronts that it sees as beneficial to its domestic standing. I don't know quite what that will look like. The big problem right before this attack was Shas was threatening to withdraw from the coalition, which could, in theory, have forced a new election, though a lot of people felt the numbers in the Knesset were such that even if Shas had withdrawn, it could have been patched over without having to hold a new vote. And the issue there was the enrollment and enlistment of yeshiva students into the military. You can easily imagine the Israeli government doing things on settlements in the West Bank to solidify its sovereign control over those places, in much the way that Smotrich and others would so desire and have been hoping for as a payout for their maintaining the coalition throughout the last year and a half since October 8. And you can imagine the Israeli government making those moves in the West Bank now while everyone is focused elsewhere.
Well, gentlemen, this has been very instructive for me, and I hope for our audience as well. I thank everyone for joining in and for posing questions. And we'll have to do it again soon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Elon Musk is sorry. Elon Musk is sorry. Elon Musk, for the first time in his life of public derangement, is publicly saying he went too far. We've been reporting to you for months now that Elon Musk went too far in the very first thing he did in government, which was to take food away from starving babies, from starving families in the middle of a famine in Sudan, and to take food away from starving people around the world who could always count on getting some food, and in many cases, enough food, in most cases actually, enough food to survive, and getting that food from us, from the United States of America, from the United States Agency for International Development, and we were always proud to deliver that food. Starving people usually didn't know where the food was coming from, but we did. And we were proud to be able to feed the starving people of the world with the surplus of food that this country has been producing for more than 100 years. The Great Plains became the breadbasket of the world when this country started producing more food than we could consume. And in the 20th century, and the United States proudly sent its first food relief shipment across an ocean in 1847, bound for Ireland to deliver famine relief there. And it wasn't enough, but it was something. Millions of Irish children and adults still starved to death. But the United States tried. The United States tried to help and did help. We sent food. We allowed Irish immigrants to come to this country where they could find work and food and never risk starvation again. And Elon Musk knew none of that history. Elon Musk never asked how many starving children were waiting for that food when he personally ordered a complete shutdown of the delivery of that food, which is now rotting in warehouses around the world. Elon Musk wanted the food to rot instead of delivering it to starving children and starving people. Elon Musk went way too far in shutting down the delivery of food to the starving around the world, the delivery of medicine, life-saving medicine to AIDS patients in Africa who have no other source of life-saving medicine. And so, yes, Elon Musk went too far. He went so far as to kill 300,000 people because there's nothing else you can call it when you take food away from starving people. The latest estimate is 300,000 deaths. And there is no one else in American history who is personally responsible for the death of 300,000 people. No one person is personally responsible for 300,000 people dying